This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Welcome back, everyone, to World to Win. We have another episode today talking about the developing situation in Ukraine. So if you haven't heard our first two episodes on it from weeks past, make sure you check those out first. You can watch them on YouTube, of course, but we're also on podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everything. Any way that you listen to podcasts, you can find us. We have two guests today to talk about the situation in Ukraine. One was with us 2 episodes ago to talk about Ukraine, and another we haven't seen in quite some time. So I'm excited to get started. But first, I want to say hello to Yaara. Yaara, how was International Women's Day?
Oh my God, it was insane. I mean, I think the best part was seeing what all of our sections around the world have been doing. But we also had a stall in London in front of one of the main train stations. It was really good to see what people are talking about. As you can hear, I'm still very croaky from both International Women's Day and we had a massive protest against the war on Sunday, and I'm still very croaky from that, so sorry about my voice. How have things been with you?
I also went to a Ukrainian protest, but for International Women's Day, in the U.S., sadly, it's not as big, so there weren't many protests, but all of our branches across the U.S. had meetings to talk about International Women's Day. And so in my city, in Boston, we talked about fighting against sexual assault in the workplace and on campus. And it was a great meeting, a great discussion, talking about, defending abortion. So it was a good day. But let's get started. So today we have Sonja back with us again. How are you, Sonja?
I'm great, thanks.
Thanks for joining us. And we also have Claire. Claire, we haven't had you on in so long. I'm glad to see you again. How have you been?
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on again.
Good. So yeah, of course, I'm sure everyone has been paying attention to the, ever developing situation. I mean, it's just super traumatic, extremely sad. But the Russian invasion into Ukraine, it continues for a third week, and it doesn't feel like there's an end in sight. We're seeing hundreds of casualties. I mean, I think it was today or yesterday, they even attacked a mother's hospital, killing 3 people. Cities are being destroyed. Apartment buildings are being destroyed. And 2 million refugees are now fleeing the country. And as we talked about before, Putin's initial plans for a quick military victory have been frustrated by a fierce resistance that he himself did not anticipate. And so in response, we have Russian army generals who are doubling down on, bombing and targeting of civilians and just creating an insane humanitarian disaster. And so, of course, this is a terrible situation, but we have seen the development of protests and demonstrations against the war, in Europe, the US, Latin America, but also in Russia itself, as we talked about last episode. So this brings up many, questions for working class people about what they themselves can do to end the bloodshed. We feel so helpless in times of war. And we see these Western powers are ramping up military aid. The U.S. just sent $12 billion to Ukraine for arms. So a lot of people are asking the question, what is it that we can do? And of course, in the International Socialist Alternative, we have no faith in the capitalist or the imperialist powers to end the war. And what we need is international working class solidarity to stop the war. And so we are going to talk about that here today. So the first question I want to ask is to Claire. For the past 2 weekends, we've seen anti-war protests and demonstrations happening across Europe, which is where you are, but also in other parts of the world. Now, some of these protests are smaller, but some of them we're seeing tens of thousands of people. Can you talk a little bit about what the mood is like and what are some of the demands that are being put forward?
Thanks, Toya. Well, yeah, like Yaara said, both me and her were on one of the protests in London at the weekend against the war in Ukraine. And I think what's taking place is obviously, as you kind of alluded to in your introduction, a complete horror show. And these are just horrific scenes that we're seeing on our television. Obviously, the last couple of days we've had these awful reports about the bombing of the maternity and children's hospital. And I think that the first thing that you pick up on the protests, but also just talking to people in daily life, in our communities, when you're doing political activity on the streets, I think that the overwhelming mood of the vast majority of working people at the moment is just a tremendous sense of solidarity with the people who are suffering this calamity. And obviously also rightful disgust at the role of Putin. And obviously that is disgust that is not limited to working class people who live in Western countries, in Europe and America and so on. It's something which is also felt by people in Russia itself. And we should also, I think, point out that the hardship and suffering that this war has created is not just something which is happening to people in Ukraine. Obviously, first and foremost, that's what's on our minds and in our thoughts. But we're also seeing tremendous hardship inflicted on ordinary people who live in Russia. So the effects of the economic sanctions are an example. I understand that as of today in Russia, you can't buy anything in a Russian shop that you can't carry in your own hands. So those kind of extreme restrictions. And obviously many people in the country will already be grieving the loss of family members who've been sent to fight, many of them against their own wishes as conscripts. And those feelings, I think, have begun to be expressed on the streets, and that's hugely positive. So we've seen demonstrations in Britain, there have been some very large demonstrations in Germany. And I think that that is positive because this cycle of bloodshed is not going to come to an end if the people who we're relying on to end it are the warmongers of Putin or the warmongers of NATO and so on, who unfortunately we know have themselves acted in a similarly barbaric way to the way that Putin's acted now. Those scenes that we're horrified by in Ukraine at the moment, in Mariupol, for example, they don't look dissimilar to the horror show that has been Yemen, for example, over the past years, where a Western-backed Saudi campaign has rained terror upon ordinary people, not too dissimilar to what ordinary people have been experiencing in Palestine under Israeli occupation, to what was experienced in Iraq or Afghanistan. We can't trust these people to bring an end to this and to bring an end which is going to restore people's livelihoods in Ukraine and allow people to have peace, security, self-determination, and so on. And that's why I think, you know, whatever looks like the beginning of an anti-war movement in Europe and in Russia and other parts of the world where we're starting to see protests, that's really important because that points in the direction of what's needed.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I went to a rally we had there that was had in Boston, and it was held by Ukrainian people. And the main demand that they were chanting was "Close the sky," which I thought was interesting. And we got into a lot of discussions about what "close the sky" actually means, and what we need to actually de-escalate the war. Sonja, what do you what's your take on the demonstrations? What are you seeing where you are?
We had some protests here as well, of course, and it's very mixed, as the audience is very mixed. Of course, some take up this idea of these demands brought forward by the ruling elites of like close the sky or getting NATO involved or so. I would not say this is because the Ukrainians are more warmongers or anything like this. It's more a reflection of not seeing an alternative. And I think this is a job of socialists to bring a real alternative in, because it's very clear that the NATO and all these ideas of further militarization is not going to be any solution. It's also interesting that various so-called progressive or lefties are actually really tail-ending the NATO propaganda. Yeah, like the Young Greens, for example, calling for the NATO. I mean, remember the Greens were like a peace party originally. So this shows very quickly their degeneration. But on the other hand, as Claire has mentioned, there is this really outstanding solidarity with the refugees. And this is something we have seen again and again. We have seen this when the refugees came from Syria. We have also seen it when, I don't know if you remember, but like 12 years ago or so, when the volcano broke out over Europe and tens of thousands of people were stranded. But also when you have an earthquake or a flood or something like this, the first reaction of people is that of solidarity and of wanting to help. And it's interesting, there are studies showing that it's especially ordinary people, people who do not have a lot of money themselves, who are much more open to help, who are giving actually, a bigger percentage of what they have compared to rich people. And I think this is something we must always be aware of when people say, yeah, this idea of socialism, that's nice, but it's not going to function because people are too greedy, too selfish or whatever. It's just not true. This situation at the moment, it shows that human beings are primarily a social animal trying to help and work together with others. And I think this is a very promising and positive thing to take up and to look for the future also of how to overcome actually this war.
I think that's really true. And, I think my entire feed on social media is full of people who have taken in Ukrainian refugees and are asking for help with food. I just saw a post about someone who's having someone over and like it's her birthday and she just fled the country. So is trying to organize a birthday for her when she doesn't know anyone where she is. So it's all about solidarity, and it's really incredible to see. But at the same time, I think that the fact that the scenes that we're seeing are so brutal, and we're seeing cities kind of demolished, but also, generally the horrors of war that we have seen in loads of different places throughout history. But I think especially in the last few years with social media that we're seeing like extraordinary people taking pictures and videos of what's happening. I think a lot of people, not just in the region, but over the world, are frightened, and they're trying, and I think it's very understandable as well, they're trying to find immediate solutions. And a lot of times I think that because we have this kind of Marxist analysis of war and of imperialism, it's very easy for us to, talk about the like big ideas of like how to defeat the system and like why we need to fight against capitalism. But I think a lot of the times we're seeing people who are asking, okay, but what are we going to do now? And I think the answer that the establishment is giving is these sanctions, is these, no-fly zone, supporting NATO, even, donating to the Ukrainian army, or sending more weapons. And I was wondering, Sonja, if you can tell us a little bit about kind of like, is that kind of like an immediate solution? Are these things going to help?
Let's start with the obvious, and this is Putin's regime has started this war. That's obvious, yeah? But we also need to see that NATO and especially the EU have been pushing quite hard to get into that war as well, yeah? And the background to this is the conflict between the US on the one side and China on the other side. That's like the big picture to it, which we must not forget, because with the development at the moment, the US tries to push the EU in its direction and to get a harder block again in future conflicts against China. Yeah, and that's we must always take into account when we think about how to react and what can we do. The NATO is very aware that a full-out conflict would be very, very dangerous, and they don't really want it. Like, they don't want these airplanes, yeah, now from Poland. It's like handed over like a hot potato because nobody really wants to get involved because they understand if it's a full war, then this is going to be out of control. Yeah, I mean, you cannot exclude that it's happening, but that's actually what nobody wants. So there is this idea of, okay, we go for sanctions because this sounds more peaceful and it sounds more like targeted. That's how they try to present it. But that's not what it actually is. Yeah, you cannot target really with a missile, although they always say they do, but then they still attack civilians, and there are civilian casualties. And it's similar with the sanctions. Yeah, the sanctions are, as Claire said, hitting mainly ordinary working class Russians. That's what the effect of it. Yeah, and that's what the target is of it at the end. Yeah, it's not, I mean, the whole war, it's not about democracy. It's not about the Ukrainian people. That's not what it is about. It's about the attempt against, as I said, to form these blocks. Yeah, and the Ukrainian people, I mean, the US and NATO, they are not interested in what the Ukrainian people or what the Russian people are affected by it. Yeah. So this idea to weaken Russia, yeah, with sanctions, they also go over bodies. I don't know if you say that in English, but they don't care about the effects of it. Yeah. Today there was a headline in an Austrian paper saying Russian economy is heading towards a bankruptcy. Yeah. So what does this actually mean? Yeah, it means that people lose their jobs because the companies have to close down. People lose their savings because of the of inflation. Yeah, and does anybody really think that the Russian regime, when they have less income, will compensate this income and in reducing the money for the military spending? I mean, nobody seriously thinks that. So they will reduce it. For example, for healthcare or for schools or for pensions. Yeah. So again, ordinary people will be affected. And I don't think there is any example in history where actually such sanctions, yeah, worked to destabilize a regime. But in reality, it's the opposite. It's stabilizing the regimes because it gives them the argumentation that the problems are coming from abroad, and therefore we have all to stick together against the foreign enemy. Yeah? So that's the one side. And the other side is that also in the West, so in the countries that actually implementing the sanctions, they are used also as an excuse for the ruling classes there to implement their cuts. So Germany has decided, or they have told, that they are going to spend an extra of 100 billion for weapons and military spending. Yeah? And this is after 2 years of Corona, where they were always said, we don't have the money for, having more staff in healthcare and more staff in education. There is no money for that. And now they spend 100 billion. Yeah? And I mean, who is going to pay for that? Yeah? It's going to be the German working class, but it's also going to be refugees, where there will be no money for them in the end. All the economic effects of the sanctions, they could push the whole world economy into a next recession, yeah? Including problems of food supply, of starvation, of people in Africa, in Asia. Yeah? This can have enormous effects. Yeah? And the ruling class uses the war as an excuse for their cuts, which they are going to do. So no, sanctions are not, there are no way to peace. No way. It's actually more a possibility to strengthen the Russian regime. And I think ordinary people actually understand that. Because when we went to the demonstration, we were collecting donations to help the anti-war movement in Russia. And this was welcomed very much. I would say 90% of the people reacted positive, and about half of the people we asked actually gave a donation. And this shows that ordinary working class people, young people, like we had on the school student strike on the 8th of March, which we linked as a strike against sexism, but also against the war. They understand that these measures taken by the ruling class are not going to solve this problem, not going to end the war.
Thanks, Sonja. So we got another question, but before we get into it, Yaara, I got to talk about this Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president. I mean, the memes and the videos that have just been made about this man. I know that before he became president, he was already, some sort of celebrity, I believe. But it's just his whole, aura and demeanor has just grown throughout this war. And I mean, what are your takes on this Zelenskyy guy, Yaara?
I think it's just like, he became a meme, and it's kind of like, I think it's kind of like a quintessential 21st century war kind of thing, where like we're all just seeing him becoming this kind of hero by social media. But I also think that it does have kind of this kind of parallel, or like maybe the opposite, like a contradiction to the way that Putin is portrayed as this kind of, the whole thing with the microphone was huge, but also like it was just showing him as this scared, crazy man who's just, he's so mentally unstable that he's gone and attacked Ukraine. And I think that is also a problematic way to view kind of this war that's been going on, because there's obviously interest behind just Putin's alleged mental instability, right? But also think that the Zelenskyy thing in particular is very interesting, because there's been this kind of whole huge thing about how great he is and all of that. And I think that can raise a lot of very important questions about how a leader who was not very liked now during war suddenly gets so much, public support. So I was wondering, Sonja, can you tell us a little bit about this? Like, are there any hopes in the Ukrainian government right now? Like, do you think that Zelenskyy is going to be able to lead Ukraine into victory, or to stop the war, or do any of the things that the internet is telling us that he's going to do?
Yeah, I mean, you raised these like media coverage and these how he's glorified at the moment, and I mean, we must be honest, he's acting different to, other politicians, take the first flight out, and this is seen positively. And also when he came to power in 2019, he presented himself as somebody different, to the establishment and so on. But having said all that, he was very down in rating and in sympathy before the war. He appeared in the Pandora Papers for having, tax-friendly possibilities to park his money. And what is probably not so widely known, just some months ago, he had a vicious attack against the Ukrainian trade unions, where he tried actually to stop collective bargaining, to individualize contracts, and to rip off the trade unions of all their property. So that's also a side that we should say. And I would say at the moment we do not see any indication that it would be different after the war if he stays in power. And this is also linked to the way he's leading that war, and who he bases himself on in the war, and who he bases his war strategy on. So what I mean with this, he leans on the military, and this is including the fascist Azov battalion, and also foreign fighters who often come from a far right and right extremist background, and the effect of these is a militarization and professionalization of the war, of like soldiers against soldiers. And this is a difference to a resistance of ordinary people on the ground. Because ordinary working class people in the Ukraine, they have been appealing when they started to resist. They have been appealing to Russian soldiers, from worker to worker. Like, what are you doing here? And that worked. It worked. It stopped, actually, in some cases, the army. But with this leaning on these militarized forces, this leads to a different way of war also, to a brutalizing of the war. And it also means if a war is won on that basis, that the danger is that, let's say Ukraine wins on that basis, with that allies in the far-right scene, that could lead to a wave of ethnic cleansing, as we have seen on the Balkans, in the Balkans War. And it could lead to a very reactionary Ukrainian system at the end of the war. So the Ukrainian workers wouldn't have won if such a regime wins. So no, I don't think that this is the solution. The problem is, and I think you said it before, people want to have an answer. The problem is, as the situation is very complicated, there is no easy answer. It's not like do sanctions and then the war is over, or support Zelenskyy and then the war is over. It's not going to work like this. But it's a much more complicated thing. What is actually needed, is the defense of and by working class people in the Ukraine on a democratically but also in a multi-ethnic way. And it's not to defend one reactionary regime against another reactionary regime. It's also not to replace the dependence on one country or bloc by the dependence on another country or bloc. It's absolutely clear, understandable, that the Ukrainian people, I mean, they have the right and the will. They want to stand up against this invasion. It's understandable, and they want to do this with all means that they have the feeling they have, but they also have the right for a real solution, which is a solution which will mean freedom and real peace, and a solution which brings a country and a society where the wealth of the Ukraine is actually used for the benefit of the Ukrainian people and not just a small elite. And that would work, I think, in the way as they started to appealing also to the Russian soldiers, but also trying to connect with the anti-war movement in Russia and internationally, but also confronting the warmongering of the NATO, but also taking up the social needs and the social demands of the people in the Ukraine. I mean, it is bizarre, that all over the world people collect for the Ukraine. Collect food, collect whatever, nappies for kids or sleeping bags. And at the same time, we have also in the Ukraine, we have super rich people who are worth, the 100 richest people in the Ukraine, they have a wealth of 45 billion euros. So why is not this money used immediately to bring, for example, sleeping bags? And food and whatever, but it's not used. So it's, I think it's necessary to combine the fight against this war, and it cannot be separated from the struggle against the capitalist system itself.
I think that's 100%. That's 100% true, and I think that there's also, I think that there's this kind of misconception that this is what the sanctions are doing. But I think you explained really well why that is not what they're doing. But also, you made a point a little bit earlier about kind of the protests that are happening in Russia, which I think are heroic, and everyone's like seeing them. And I think that the experience that you talked about in Austria in the protests, we saw that as well in London. We also did the same thing of like asking for donations for the anti-war movement in Russia. And everyone seems supportive of it. And I think a lot of people also, and if we're talking about Zelenskyy, we're also seeing on social media all these stories about like the heroism of the people who are protesting right now, despite the incredible levels of repression that are happening in Russia. And also, if you check out our previous episode, we also talked about this quite a bit. But I was wondering why, I was wondering if Claire, you could tell us a little bit about why it's so important that there are these protest movements in Russia, but also outside of Russia, and like what kind of nature do they have to take? Is it enough for them to just protest against the movement? Can that win a stop to the war?
Yeah, thanks, Yaara. Well, I think first of all, to echo the point you've made about the heroism of Russian working class and young people coming out onto the streets in Russia. And I would also say, we don't say that cheaply or lightly when you're talking about the sorts of things that people are facing if they do take that step of not necessarily even coming out on the streets, but simply expressing publicly their views which are against this war. And there's an incredible ratcheting up of the dictatorial powers which there are in Russia. Obviously, this wasn't a place where it was easy for socialist campaigners, trade unionists, and so on to operate beforehand. As ISA, we've routinely been called to solidarity with activists who've been facing repression. But we have to say that this has now taken on a completely different scale and, a really, really incredibly brutal character. So obviously there's some of the stuff that we will have seen reported here in Europe, but in Western Europe, but 15-year sentences, for example, are now potentially going to be handed down to people who are found guilty of spreading so-called fake news, i.e. news which reports on, the realities, or at least some of the reality of what's taking place in Ukraine and the war. We've already seen thousands of people arrested and thrown in jail, often for, weeks, months, and so on. And as has already been said, obviously there's, despite that, still a willingness amongst a layer of people in Russia to continue to protest. But I think it's also true that, we're just at the start of this. Russian people are suffering, as has been discussed, some really terrible economic consequences to what's happening. As I said earlier, there are people who've been forced to go and fight. And Putin's attempting to use that to kind of whip up a sort of siege mentality, bolster support, create a mood of national unity behind himself. And obviously the oligarchs and the billionaires are able to protect themselves from the worst of these hardships. And, we have to look, I think, when we ask, how do you stop a war? It's actually a really big question, and it's a really difficult thing to stop a war. We can look to the best examples that there are in our history, examples of when ordinary people have been able to take action, and through that action to bring an end to war. And funnily enough, the best example that I think we have in the whole of history is actually the example of something which took place in Russia just over 100 years ago, the Russian Revolution, which was organised under the slogan of peace, bread and land, and peace came first in that list. And among the first acts of the government that was formed in Russia by workers, the first time in history that workers themselves were able to form their own government, the first act was to sue for peace. And that obviously also went alongside, as actually, ironically, Putin himself has referred to, granting self-determination to oppressed nations which were within Russia. And, it might seem crazy in a way to be talking about this example from 100 years ago, but we know that the force within society, which ultimately is going to have the power to affect and influence what Putin and his regime does, and obviously, conversely in the West, the force that's going to be able to ultimately bring an end to militarism and so on that side, we know that the force that has the power to do that is actually working class people. And that's not out of some romantic idea. It's because of the role of workers within society. And we've seen just a tiny glimpse of that in Britain recently, over this war, actually, where workers on the docks in Kent and in Liverpool have taken action themselves, taken matters into their own hands, and have refused to unload Russian oil and gas. And we would say that that's miles apart from the sanctions regime of, say, Boris Johnson or whatever. That really points to the potential power that working class people have. And they have that power in Russia. They have that power in, Western Europe and so on. They have that power everywhere in the world, actually. And that's the potential that we're pointing towards.
I'm really glad that Claire was able to, talk about the role of the working class in stopping the war. And I think that example of the dock workers is really inspiring. The other day, though, I want to talk about the refugees a little bit. The other day, I saw a political cartoon. And, thinking about the 2 million refugees that are leaving Ukraine, this cartoon showed, a group of children in the shadows with their flags. So we saw like a Syrian flag and a Palestinian flag and a Yemenis flag. And then in the spotlight, there was a blonde girl with the Ukrainian flag. It was basically talking about the fact that we have millions of refugees or displaced people who are in war-torn countries who are not getting the same media attention or the same support from Western countries, for example, as the Ukrainians are. And even within Ukraine's borders, the people who are fleeing, we've seen many reports about how, African and Indian students or Black people who are living in Ukraine, maybe they're Ukrainian citizens, when they get to the border, they're not allowed to leave, or they are, going through many more hassles. And it's not a question of resources, as Sonja mentioned earlier. There are billionaires within Ukraine who can be helping to get these people out and, give them what they need to get back home and be safe on their way out. What we're seeing is acts of racism. But Sonja, as a socialist, how do we talk about the question of refugees leaving war-torn areas, or even refugees who are leaving for economic reasons? How do we talk about that?
Well, first, I wouldn't separate between different types of refugees. If people have to leave their country, then it's always very, very serious. Nobody's doing it because it's funny or something like that. As you see with these refugees, or with all refugees, the use or mistreatment of refugees by governments is always depending on the needs of the ruling governments or parties. So at the moment, they need to have a friendly eye towards Ukrainian refugees, because they can use it for their warmongering. That can change actually very quickly. And they also use it to whip up nationalism, to whip up racism. And there have been really horrible reports about the border and the treatment of, let's say, non-white, non-blonde and blue-eyed refugees at the Ukrainian-Polish border. And there has been a lot of politicians in Europe taking this up, saying, oh yes, but they are like ours, they are Christians, they are white, which of course, this is just open racism. And it's used also to divide and rule between the good and the bad refugees, which of course is absolutely nonsense. And it's something we have to stand up against. As I said, if people have to flee their country, then it's always very serious. And it's actually, it's the policy of the rich countries, of the big companies, the monopolies, the war industry, the companies that are, for example, destroying nature, that pushing countries into war. And they are responsible for people having to flee their country. So actually, they are the ones that have to pay for it. That's what we should demand. Yeah? I think it's dangerous if you limit yourself to say, we are in solidarity and that's it. Yeah? Because of course, if there are more people in the country, that costs. And we have to answer where the money should come from. But the money is there, as you said. It's absolutely there. Take the money from the war industry. Yeah? Take it from the super rich. Open the books of the companies. Look where their profit is coming from. How they benefited from making deals with dictators, with the oil industry and all that. Look into that books, yeah, and then take the money and use it to help the refugees, but also people who are poor in the countries. Yeah, and this is the way, not to get diverted between natives and refugees, but to see that it's not white skin against dark skin, or whatever religion against whatever religion, but it's a question of the poor against the rich. Yeah, and therefore this is a very, very strong question we have to take up as socialists, defending the right of people who have to flee their country.
Yeah, I think 100% about that. I know actually in the protests in London, one of our main chants was refugees in, oligarchs out, which I think, obviously it's a chant, but I think that is really kind of shows the cynicism of governments that are like letting the rich in, but not letting refugees who actually need a place to stay to come in, and especially when there's so much wealth, like you say, that can actually pay for all of these refugees, including refugees from outside of Ukraine, from Palestine, Syria, Yemen, and so on.
Yeah, on our International Socialist Alternative website, there's a really good article that we just put out, written by our South African section, who talks a little bit more about this and the role that the capitalists and the government leaders, even within Africa, are playing in this situation, and what we need to put forward in order to help the refugees. So that'll be in the description. That link will be in the description.
And I think there's sometimes this kind of instinct that some people on the left have of like whataboutism, we can't talk about Ukraine because we haven't talked enough about A, B, or C. And I think as socialists, it's really important that we say that the fact that we're talking about Ukraine now doesn't mean that the problems and the wars that are happening outside of Ukraine are less significant or important. We are 100% fighting against all of these things. We're fighting against all of the types of exploitation and oppression that are brought on by this capitalist system and by imperialism as well. So I actually want to circle back kind of to, Sonja, something that you said a little bit earlier in the show. Because you said how we need to connect kind of the anti-war movement to the fight against the system. And I think that this was also a clear explanation, especially the refugee element, of how this system is directly connected to the war and how to deal with the war as well, and how it's been dealing with the war. So can you maybe kind of tell us very briefly, how do you think these two things can be connected in this anti-war movement?
Okay, look, if you're ill and you go to a doctor, you don't want to have a doctor who's just dealing with your symptoms. You want him or her to go to the roots of the problem. And that's what it is about. Capitalism is rooted in competition, and it is competition between countries, dealing with the interests of their respective companies. Yeah, it's about access to resources, to markets, and so on. So this competition again and again and again leads to wars. This is in the DNA of capitalism. And there is no half solution. In the First World War, the socialist women's movement around Clara Zetkin, they were fighting for an end to war. Claire raised before, the best and most successful anti-war movement was the Russian Revolution. There were also Russian revolutions in other countries. Yeah? Workers rising up against the war and combining it with a struggle against capitalism, because they understood that these two things cannot be separated. But the problem was that, different to Russia, in the rest of the world, the social democratic leadership stopped the revolution and saved capitalism. And that might have not been the big catastrophe at the moment in 1918 or 19. But 20 years later, we had the Second World War. And this was because the revolution was stopped by the social democracy. So there is no half solution in ending wars. It can only be ended one and forever if you stop capitalism. And if you look at the results that this war, or the effects that this war can have, as we have been speaking about, more wars, more tensions in other parts of the world, hunger, natural disaster, more nuclear power, getting back to coal, all these things, yeah, this will lead to further tensions and more dangers of war. So there is no solution, no, NATO or UN or anything like this. It can only be stopped if working class people all over the world get active. And they do it. They have been doing it historically. They have been doing it in Genoa and in other parts of the world where they instinctively understand that this is also against their own interests. And in 1940, there was a congress where the coming together in the resolution of revolutionaries. And this was a really dark period. Yeah, it was at the German army, was going over Europe, and it looked like, oh my God, the world is going to end. Yeah, and Trotsky made very clear. He said it is an absolutely error to think that this is the end and to be pessimistic, because he understood that war is also the midwife of revolution, and he understood and pointed to the fact that one of the results of World War I was the Russian Revolution. And I think this is something we should never forget. It can turn very quickly. We see at the moment, we see support, some sort of support of militarization. But this will quickly turn around when it is clear where these policies leading to. And then we have a generation of young people who understand since years that this system is it's leading nowhere. It's not going to solve the climate crisis. It's not going to solve the COVID crisis. It's not going to solve the refugee crisis. It's not going to solve any crisis. It's just leading to more and more and more crises. And this young generation, they are demanding system change. And we have to explain that the system change that is needed is a socialist change where people all over the world take the power, take the wealth of their own hands of work, in their own hands, decide together democratically, and this is the way to end exploitation, but this is also the end for one and forever to stop wars and finish it and have a peaceful life in dignity and security for everybody.
Thank you so much, Sonja and Claire, for joining us today. This has been a really informative episode and an important episode. Again, if you are just tuning into this one and you haven't heard our 2 previous shows on the situation in Ukraine, please check those out as well. And now for the shout out of the week, Yaara, do you wanna take this one?
Yes, so I think everyone can guess what the shout out is this week. And obviously it was International Women's Day this Tuesday. And we want to shout out every single person that went down to the street to protest this International Women's Day, and especially our International Socialist Alternative members who have played really significant roles in the protests around them, whether it was organising a demo or participating in one. They all played really important roles in the movement and have been playing a really important role in the movement generally beyond International Women's Day. So I want to really shout out, and there's so many impressive videos and speeches and photos all around the International Socialist Alternative social media. So I really recommend to check that out. It's really amazing to see, especially if you're in a country that has maybe less big protest about it. It's really amazing to see what some of our members have done. But we were out all around the world, from Brazil to Austria and everywhere in between. So really inspiring stuff. And also, if you haven't seen, instead of World to Win last week, we had a really impressive international rally with speakers from all around the world about International Women's Day. So you should check that out, definitely. And I think that in the context of what we just talked about the war and, this kind of age of disorder that we're living in, it's incredibly important, more than ever, for socialist feminist ideas to be kind of at the forefront and linked to all kinds of oppression, all kinds of exploitation. And I know that in the protest that we had in London, we had a specific speech that connected kind of the issues to the war in Ukraine. And I know that many of our protests did have this, didn't make this connection specifically. And I think it's really, really important that we talk about this as well. So shout out to everyone who was on the streets and everyone who wanted to be on the streets but couldn't. Hopefully next International Women's Day you can be out. And before we go, just want to make a little announcement. World to Win is going to start becoming a fortnightly show, so every 2 weeks. So we won't see you next week, but we're going to see you the week after. So see you then.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!